Middle Path Radio, your number one online Islamic talk station.
Welcome to Straight Talk, a current affairs show covering a wide array of topics, from societal matters to religious issues, from political injustice to economic subjugation, and much more. We say it as it is and let you speak your mind. Join in the discussion as we proceed with this evening's Straight Talk.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Good evening. Welcome to Straight Talk on Middle Path Radio. I am your host, Quddus Ali. Tonight we are discussing grooming and pedophilia ring in the Western system. Recently we have seen the media's relentless attack, in particular the media links grooming with Muslims. Is grooming linked to a religion, race and ethnicity, or is it a much wider problem rooted in the Western liberal system? To discuss this important matter, I have two guests on the studio, Brother Abu Omar, who is a teacher, and Brother Nizal Hussain, who is a structural engineer and a community activist. Assalamu alaikum, brothers.
Wa alaikum salam.
Barakallah fiqh. So if I could start with Brother Abu Omar, what is exactly happening with regards to grooming and the scale of the problem in the community we live in?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me on this show.
Wa alaikum salam.
I wasn't on before, so I have to, greet you again. Well, the thing is, when you actually say in the community, I guess you perhaps actually mean the Muslim community.
Muslim and non-Muslim community
Muslim
as well.
and non-Muslim community. Okay, let's actually talk about the Muslim community. I think this was highlighted, predominantly in the newspapers, that this issue is actually linked to the Muslim community. But for the listeners, I would actually want to explain what grooming is, child grooming is, because a lot of people some people might not actually know the real definition of what it means to be grooming children. Grooming children is actually luring vulnerable young kids, especially underage girls, into having sexual encounters and trafficking them for child pornography and prostitution, etc. Now, from this definition, we can easily think that this is a very, very serious crime. And by no stretch of imagination, we can actually totally brush this on the Muslim community. Because as we all know, that Muslim community is a very value-held community. They have very high moral values. We see the women actually wear modest clothing. We see that women use the private space. We see how, for example, the Muslim men and women, segregate. And to actually say that it's a Muslim thing or it happens in the Muslim community, I think it's too much, stretching the definition too much.
Surely, I see your point. Surely it cannot be linked to any religion. These things are, if you look at the media, if you study the statistics on this, from my understanding, it's not really related to any religion. Is it?
Even I think it's not even related to ethnics, because a lot of the times actually papers have suggested that it's an Asian thing as well. The reason why they actually say that it's an Asian thing is because those particular cases in whether it's in Derby or whether it's in Rotterdam, those cases that were highlighted were actually the people that were found happened to be Muslims. And there were 5 or so, sometimes 7 or so Muslims. But they were saying that, if we look at the demography of the Muslims and Asians living in this country, and the cases that we find that, a high proportion of Muslims or Asians are involved in this. But this is not true. This is really not true, I think, and we will further on we will actually explain, for example, why this is the case. It's something to do with nighttime economy. But if it was to do with Asian, how come Indians are not doing it? If it was to do with actually Muslims, how come?
What about the politicians? There's a lot of politicians and celebrities who are involved in this grooming.
Of course.
Recently David Danzak, for example, he was texting a 16-year-old girl. And there's many politicians, and unfortunately they're not Muslims.
Yes, I know. I understand that these people are not Muslim. I think this whole thing about child grooming is actually very, very widespread amongst the society. Jimmy Savile, we heard the case about Jimmy Savile. We know that a lot of MPs are, involved in this, and there's a lot of cover-up. We also know, for example, Theresa May have actually opened up a lot of cases with regards to the pressure from the society and the outburst of this, exposure about, how come this has, gone loose for so long, and how come the cover-up has been, for so long. But as I said, that it's not a Muslim issue, it's not an ethnic issue. Otherwise, we'd find Indians on it. Otherwise, we'd find, Middle Eastern on it. But it's not the case.
Okay, thank you. Brother Nizal Hussain, Brother Mamoon has just explained eloquently the definition of grooming. Can you explain in terms of, is it a religious thing? Because I find it very difficult to comprehend the fact that it's actually linked to any religion or any ethnicity.
Well, if we take only recently in 2012 we had the incident in Rochdale in Manchester. We had the issue of nine Asian men, Muslim men of a Muslim background, who were caught, they were grooming underage girls. They were found guilty. It had a huge issue in the media at the time, and not just at the time. It's even had an issue even today. It's expanded debates, discussions over that event that took place all the way in 2012. But even only 2 weeks after the event, after the 9 Muslim men who committed those crimes, which no doubt was despicable, disgusting, only 2 weeks afterwards, 10 non-Muslim men within Rochdale were found of doing the same crime. It obviously didn't receive the same...
What were they? Were they non-Muslim, meaning are they white men? Or non-Muslim, I understand that, but were they white? Were they black? Or were they Asian?
They were predominantly white.
Okay, so that just shows it's not an Asian thing either. Yeah,
it's not an Asian thing, but essentially the methods used by the 10 non-Muslim men were essentially the same methods used by the 9 Muslim men, which was they used drink, they used alcohol, they used drugs. They used that on vulnerable girls who were essentially, some of the girls had run away from home. And this is a recurring theme you find within the north of England, but including the south as well.
Sorry, these men, were they, what kind of occupational background did they come from? Were they professionals or were they working class? Because that's another issue I was going to come to, because as I said earlier, politicians are involved in it, celebrities are involved in this. Rolf Harris, for example, Jimmy Savile, Max Clifford. These type of household brand names in terms of their celebrity level, they're also involved in it.
Yeah, so you mentioned the high end, the high level within society, but these 10 men were just working class men, so they were not, it wasn't anything upper middle class or anything like this, and it was based in Rochdale, same social environment as that of the 9 Asian men, Muslim men. So, but for some reason, the 10 non-Muslim men didn't receive the same media focus, but essentially the same situation. It's a tragedy for whichever group of girls were abused by whichever men. It's a tragedy nonetheless.
Jazakallah khair. Just to remind the listeners, you can call in on 07477 080248, or you can text us as well. Please let us have your say, your comments, any questions you may have for the panelist. Brother Abu Omar, you, as we've kind of resolved this issue of the fact that it's not a Muslim thing. If it's not a Muslim thing, then why is it that the media is seeking to, when it's linking the Muslim community, why is the media making an utmost effort in linking it to the Muslim community, issue of grooming? I think
the thing is, in my point of view, the issue about child grooming and pedophilia is very, very widespread. And as you have actually said that, there have been cases of, widespread, cover-up in the parliament, the Westminster, with the MPs, with the police. There are some collusions with the police as well. It's a very, very widespread thing. But when it comes to sometimes Muslims and Asians, it's a one-off issue, and I think this is the time when actually the newspapers actually picks this up and sensationalizes the whole story, because these are rare issues sometimes, in the context of the bigger, wider, impact that the society faces when it comes to vulnerable young girls, and how the people in the society actually abuse, whether they are celebrities, whether they are teachers, having a fling with underage girls, whether we have heard of stories where a teacher would actually take the girl another country to actually avoid police catching. So these things are very, very widespread. But when something such as when Asians are involved, and unfortunately they have been involved in those cases and they have been convicted, the media takes that because it's a rare thing and sensationalize it, because it actually sells the newspaper. People buy it.
Is it because that they will is it because there is an ideological alternative out there which they fear? Is there a fear factor for the media? Because why aren't they not attacking other religions, for example, and link other religions, Christianity,
yes, that's
Judaism?
Right. When they actually again, I think Muslims are a very close-knit community.
So they effectively been cornered, the Muslim community,
that's
if
right.
you think about it. Why is it the case?
Yeah, because the Muslims are a very close-knit community. They are a very conservative community. They uphold, very conservative values of Islam. As I said, the women are men and women are segregated. They dress modestly.
But some listeners will say, this is the very problem then the Muslim community have, that you guys find it difficult to integrate. How do you? Because some listeners will have that concern.
I'm just saying that when something happens which is an excess from that situation, then the media picks it up and highlights it. And I think one of the other thing is that Islam bashing and Muslim bashing has become a kind of a norm. We see that, for example, in USA, how Donald Trump has been using the Muslim and Islam card to actually win the election, and we've seen a lot of the cases in this country as well. And unfortunately, there are a lot of Islamophobes out there, and especially tabloid newspapers. They really want to actually, pick those issues to sell newspapers, because if you look at their news content, it's not hard and substantiated content. They'll talk about celebrity issues.
Just sorry to interrupt. Brother Nizal, you wanted to come in on this one?
Yeah.
Why is it the media is specifically attacking the Muslim community?
Well, going back to the question about integration, to do with, the Muslims have a problem of integration itself.
Because that's the argument some people have.
But I'd say about the 9 men in Rochdale, they were highly integrated into British society.
In what ways? Were they drinking?
They were drinking, they were taking drugs, they were plying girls with drink as well.
But is that the sign of integration? What do you understand by integration, do you think?
Well, obviously that's a completely extreme opposite, extreme end of the spectrum. I'm not, by any means, I'm not saying that Western culture is all about drink and drugs only, but at the same time we have to consider these men were part of the nighttime economy. That's something that's part of the modern end of a globalized economy that started off with the West. Having a nighttime economy, essentially you've got cab drivers. A lot of the men were cab drivers. They were working late hours, late shifts in takeaway fast food chains. It's around this time when vulnerable girls, some of them were missing from home, some of them needed a warm place to stay, and if I just give you an example, a very quick example here, ignoring Rochdale in Manchester and just focusing on a completely different area, in Rotherham, there was an inquiry called the Rotherham Inquiry, and it was drawn up by Alexis J., and that's why it was known as the J Report. And in there, they explained there was so much sex abuse against children within the region, within the area. They were trying to understand what were the reasons, and there were 15 set of bullet points related to this. I'm not going to go through all of them. We probably can do later on. Yeah, but amongst them were issues to do with the nighttime economy. And I don't know if the Muslim world generally, if they do have a vibrant nighttime economy to do with nightclubs, to do with red light districts. I'm not too sure. I'm not aware of that. So, but you find that exists in places, whether it's Liverpool, Manchester, and the big cities. And these 9 Muslim men were very much integrated into that culture. So if anything, if these 9 men were more involved in a more traditional Muslim culture, possibly they may have avoided this.
Jazakallah khair. Brother, the sexual exploitation seems to be an everyday occurrence. However, can you shed some light as to how wide this problem is? I mean, because you've just given a couple of isolations. Can you just say how wide this problem is? Because the listeners, I'm sure, would want to know.
Various charities, children's charities, have actually done their own independent inquiries on this. So, for example, ignoring the J report, which was very famous and popular to do with Rotherham, not Rochdale, but Rotherham. You then had Barnardos, the children's charity in Scotland. They wanted to do a report on sex abuse in Scotland in general. They also looked at the J inquiry and tried to compare their findings with that, and that's where they found the 15 bullet points. And it becomes clear and obvious that child abuse, specifically to sexual child abuse, is just so widespread, and it's to do with two main groups of things, but they break down into the 15 bullet points that the inquiry found. First main set of reasons, it's to do with institutional failures. For example, on part of the police, there was issues to do with the threshold of what constituted as abuse was way too high. So many of the children who were abused, they had signs of abuse. Police neglected it because it was disregarded as minor abuse. So this was deflected. There were situations where social care people would ignore certain cases. Within Rotherham itself, 63% of the kids who were abused were either missing or were partly homeless or they were in poverty. And you find this recurring theme all the time of poverty. Unemployment was higher than the national average in these areas.
Sorry, I've just got a text from a listener. The question from Mamunba is, why does the media not pick up on grooming in the church? Everyone knows it happens, but the media rather pick up on isolated individuals.
I think the society...
That's a very good question, actually.
Yes, it's a very good question. But the thing is, the society actually... we do actually hear, I have heard many times in the newspaper how priest and pedophilia actually goes on
and teachers
within the the Vatican, etc. So it's not necessarily true. There is media sensationalism on,
but it's not as widely promoted or discussed. I think that's what the point is.
Yes, so
because this is very important. The listener feels that it's not being discussed widely and undermined the way a Muslim would be undermined. For example, if you look at the Cologne situation in Germany, for example, it was completely blown out of proportion. It seems that there's something that the media is against, and that's just a fact.
I think one of the reasons why, for example, there is, of course, definitely news reports about the church people and the priests mishandling and mistreating the girls, but because the people who are concerned and attached to those mistreatments are very wide and far apart, and therefore who's going to actually bark? Because everyone's in a way responsible. But when it comes to the Muslims, because they are a very small minority living in Britain, I think everyone can actually pounce on them and jump on them as soon as a media report about Muslims abuse has happened. And I think this is the case. So everyone actually shouts on that. But I just wanted to actually say about the vulnerability. I think what we really need to question is that how come the society actually, churning out all these, youngsters who are very vulnerable? Because I actually have a case in my own hand, actually. One of my relatives, actually, when he was actually talking about the nighttime economy, he works in a restaurant, and he was coming home, and in the bus stop, he found a girl. And that girl was obviously cold, was shivering, didn't know where to go.
This was at the night time, was it? Late night.
So he said, how are you? What do you want? Are you okay? And I think they, built up an emotional relationship out of that. So what he did is he took that girl home, and the girl doesn't want to go back. Maybe she was actually facing hardship in her family. Her father was probably drinking. Her mom wasn't taking care of her. So she came from a poor family. She also had a dyslexia and reading age problem and etc. and all that. So eventually, what happened is that he got he developed they developed a relationship.
But that's the whole point. See, this is what they're arguing, isn't it? That the Muslim men are enticing girls of that.
This is not.
Can you clarify? Because
this is not enticement. This is actually trying to protect that girl who was vulnerable.
So what you're saying is that there's other social ills which makes children, young girls,
right,
especially vulnerable.
Yes.
That could be due to many other issues,
Exactly.
parenting, single parent, societal issues.
That's right. This is something we need to address.
Jazakallah. If I could come to Brother Nizal on this question, shall I repeat the question, or you, the brother had the list? Yeah. So what he said is, why does the media not pick up on grooming in the church? Everyone knows it happens, but the media rather pick up on isolated individuals.
Okay.
So that was the question from the listener.
For me personally, I think the media has focused a lot on the church abusing children, and the reason being is that this society is no longer a Christian society; it's a secular society. So the elitists today are not necessarily conservative Christians. They are usually atheists sometimes, so it makes sense to undermine the church.
Yeah, because there's been an argument that Britain is no longer a Christian country. Its state religion is no longer.
Its state religion is secular. It's secular. It's all about freedom.
Yeah. So it's not about Christianity.
You do what you want as long as you're free and happy to do so. So when you create that kind of a mentality, you break the boundaries, So the situation now you have, even if we look at the past, for example, if it's not ignoring the cultural dimension, focusing on a generation dimension, if you look at the
elderly... Is freedom, you mentioned freedom, is freedom not a good thing? Because as long as I'm not harming you, what's wrong with that? This is you've just touched on freedom, you say.
So for example, people will talk of freedom, particularly in Hollywood movies. For example, Second World War, their grandparents fought and died for today's freedoms. But the reality is is that the parents, they fought and died for political freedoms against the Germans, right? Now, if you were to get the grandfathers and the great-grandfathers and make them look at the liberal values today in today's society, they would say it's completely foreign to what they had. I remember years ago when I was a student working part-time, and there was an elderly couple who walked in. We just got discussing, and they said they married when they were 18 and 19.
So it seems to me from what you're saying that freedom intrinsically has a lot of ills. There's a lot of disadvantages because it creates social havoc and chaos in society.
The social freedoms we have today is completely alien and foreign to what the older British English generation had years ago, during the Second World War era even. It's completely foreign and different. So this idea of freedom, this excessive idea of freedom, democracy, all of that used to be associated more with American nationalism. Now that for some reason Britain has adopted.
I think the freedom in this context is I'm free as long as I'm not harming you. I can have a promiscuous relationship. I can go out. If the other person is consenting, I can have relationship. I think that it's from that point. But that in itself is problematic, isn't it? Because
it is. Because in an idealistic, simple, on an idealistic level, you can say that freedom as long as I'm not harming anyone. But then the danger is, in practice, you will invariably harm someone. So, for example, you can look at the situation now in Switzerland, in Sweden as well, and Holland and France. First-degree incest is now legalized. So first-degree incest is where it's between a father and a daughter, for example. That's first-degree. Between a brother and a sister, that's first-degree incest, provided they're consenting adults. The problem is with this is... it's impossible from the perspective of freedom, as long as you're not harming anyone, because they're both consenting adults. You, on that basis of freedom, you cannot oppose it. You can't oppose incest, first-degree incest, because if the brother and sister agree to it, who is anyone to oppose that on the basis of freedom? You can't. But those values, those modern values, are completely foreign and alien to the Christian grandparents that existed in France and Britain all those decades ago.
Jazakallah khair.
Can I just add on to this? There's another problem. With
I have another two texts to read out to question, but please carry on.
I just wanted to actually add on to this point, is that it's not only the liberal values or the freedom of values. There's another issue about, the state, the British state or the Western state has become more and more sort of like a nanny state, in where, for example, it actually intervenes into the day-to-day lives of the people in general. So, for example, like with those vulnerable girls, these vulnerable girls could have been looked after by their family, could have been looked after by their grandmother, grandparents, or their first cousins, or their uncles. Yeah, but instead what happens that the social service is given power to take them away. And the staff at the social services center, they view this as a job, and
So
they're not.
that's
so
the very reason why people are taking advantage of this type of
and this
girls,
is exactly
you see.
why, because this country has become a nanny state. It controls every individual. It separates the individual from the fabric of family values, and this is the problem. So, for example, like, it would ask, for example, women and men to go to work at the expense of actually giving their 1-year-old child to a childminder, and we can see the consequences of that.
You can't trust some of
for
the
example,
childminders
like,
even.
By saying that you can't discipline your child, the responsibility is now, for example, with the teachers, and the teachers can't actually handle the classroom at the moment. So for example, the government is actually saying now they're going to scratch QTS. This is only yesterday's news, and they're going to make head teachers now recruit because of people management problems.
So these are the intrinsic problems associated with freedom and values, free values, basically liberal values.
Yeah,
The other text I've got from the listener here, he says, you keep referring to these child abusers as Muslim men. The white abusers are not referred to as white Christian or liberal men. Why is it that is that the case, Brother Nizal?
Well, it's interesting. The person who said this, because we can look at, for example, the J inquiry, which it's become infamous. It's always used. It's the Rotherham inquiry, essentially. It's always used to hit Muslims on the head, because from one of the 15 points they mentioned in this inquiry, the inquiry dealt with a period of 12 years, I believe, and they looked at child sex abuse in and around Rotherham. One of the points it mentioned...
It's not just in Rotherham, as I mentioned earlier. It's everywhere. I think it's very important for the listeners to know. It's happening in Parliament Square and Houses of Parliament as well. And
because even Barnardos, the child charity in Scotland, they looked at the inquiry and they said the same thing that was taking place throughout Scotland. So it's a well-spread problem, but Rotherham is a small area where they were able to analyse the situation in more detail. But in all of these issues, there's so many points to consider. One of the points they made was that we shouldn't be politically correct in recognising if there is an issue amongst the immigrant community. This is what the report said. However, the same report said 14 other points, and even more, 14 other points, which for some reason the media has focused hardly on them. There's so many points to do with them, which is to do with the nightlife that exists in certain areas. Again, it's to do with freedom, children going out very late at night.
So again, also all these are related to facilities and freedoms that people enjoy. Yeah,
but it all
comes down to that, isn't it?
But it's not just the culture of freedom. It's to do with institutional failures. So, for example, we should have some trust in social care. If you have a situation where freedom culture has broken the family, you expect then social care to take some responsibility. But the problem the
state already made it very clear in this in Western societies. They made it. They're not going to interfere in people's private lives. If you look at the free market Western economy, in terms of the behavior,
time and time again, they have actually
how have they?
So, for example, with one of my friends, recently, just because his daughter, who is about 6 years old, she says that, look, I don't want to play with teddy bear or something. I don't want to take it home. And the teachers ask, why don't you want to take it home? Oh, because we don't play with teddy bears. And I think somehow they found out that maybe their parents have been, teaching that child that, shouldn't have it. So
now that's from a cornering the Muslim point of view. They would definitely, obviously, this is not the right time or the right place, because in terms of through prevent, they want to monitor us. But I'm coming for my point is that the state, liberal state like the Britain, for example, is not going to interfere and dictate how people should live their lives. For example, from a sexual orientation point of view, sexuality point of view, on these things, for example, what kind of relationship you have, whether you should be married, whether you shouldn't be married. The state doesn't really say, and that is a problem, because that intrinsically causes all these nightlife problems you were discussing, Brother Nizal, isn't it?
Yes. What I would say, something very fundamental to all of this, is that in society, if you look at it this way, in society you have two groups of institutions. You've got government institutions, right? And then you also have the institution of the family. Now,
which is fragmented, because
which
Mr.
is
Cameron
fragmented.
and even Blair was discussing it when he was in
That's
power,
right.
the social fabric of this society as fragmented, broken into pieces.
That's it. And a good comparison of that, if you look at, for example, Muslim societies, but not just Muslim societies, in the less developed part of the world, there's more reliance on family, extended relatives. Not necessarily the system, because sometimes there is no system, there is no government, or if the government exists, it doesn't have many systems in place anyway. So, as an example, if you're looking for work and you're not living in the West, you'd have to rely on contacts from families through uncles to get a job, essentially. So that creates a psychology in those parts of the world where people rely on contacts, family. The family institution becomes very powerful. In the Western world, what tends to happen is the family scale down a bit.
It's very selfish. It
becomes a nuclear family instead of extended relatives. You then rely on institutions. Then children being raised, their moral upbringing is based on teachers now rather than parents. You have the situation in Parents' Evening where the parents themselves will ask the teacher, "My kids aren't behaving well. What are you doing about it?" But any common sense, grandparents in this society only a few decades ago would have said, no, as parents, you take the responsibility. So we go down this direction of, as you said, on the one hand, it's a nanny state, but on the other hand, the government doesn't want to interfere. But it's impossible. The government has to interfere, because when you break down the family, when the family becomes weaker, that's when you need all these social care. You need all the institutions to take the influence of the family. So if the family is not doing the job, unfortunately, then you need social care to do it for you.
Jazakallah khair. Brother Abu Omar, grooming is not an isolated crime. For the benefit of our listeners, can you explain why this is such a serious crime and its associative negative impact on the society, e.g. drugs, theft, disease, unhealthy family life?
Yeah, of course, this is a very, very serious crime. And when you especially have all these rings and all these gangs operating, and they don't actually operate in, lush and posh places, they most tend to have, operate in actually, alleyways, down the corner, dark corners over there. And those places are not necessarily sort of like, polished and all that. So the associated crimes related from that, it will be like, AIDS, a breakup of families. There'll be like, violence, crime, murder, knife crime, and all sorts of things going on.
Illegitimate children, for example, a lot of abortion in hospitals.
A lot of abortion in hospitals and things like that. A lot of family will then be actually a social services intervention. There's also a cost to the state as well.
Absolutely,
so
through the welfare benefits.
Welfare benefit, millions and millions of pounds. For example, all these investigations that are done, for example, over the MPs and celebrities, court cases, all taxpayers' money. So everyone is, end of the day, is affected by this, as well as diseases and all sorts of things.
Jazakallah khair. And Brother Nizal, you wanted to come in on this one?
Yes, I just wanted to mention a few points that was noted in the J inquiry. First of all, as an example in Rotherham, if a children who had been abused, if they missed their first therapy counselling session, their names would be removed off the list. There's just so many issues. What the police considered a case of abuse, the threshold was way too high. So kids who did have, where there was evidence of abuse, sometimes it will be neglected or disregarded. So we have the example of 2 boys who were raped and they were disregarded.
Subhanallah. So it's a burying the problem in the sand, isn't it? Burying their head in the sand.
The problem there was institutional. So even if we disregard the issue of family values, it's a systematic issue. So another classic problem the J inquiry found was there were just too many agencies involved. So the information of the children who were abused, information was being sent from one institution to another. The institutions were not gelling well together. That created friction. A classic point was in 2006, Ofsted judged Rotherham Council as being successful against child sex abuse. But when the J report looked back on this and did their own analysis, they found they'd actually failed. So you see many issues. There was unemployment higher than the national average. The take-up of welfare benefits in that area was higher than the English average. you see, there's all these issues. These are points I've mentioned.
Problems on and on. It seems that without
yeah.
any kind of solution
Yeah.
coming from the
points,
state.
Yeah, these points were mentioned in the J inquiry, which focuses on the causes of child sex abuse. So you can see it there. Hardly any of them was mentioned on the newspapers.
Well, those people who look up to, even the politicians who are the statesmen of the nation, they themselves are corrupt. Yeah, so I don't think what more can you expect from them in terms of trying to burying the head under the sand. Brother Nizal, can you please explain why this is happening, particularly in such a large scale in Western society? Because it is a Western problem, as it were, in terms of, from what you've said, it's quite proliferated and it's everywhere. So why is it that it cannot be, why is it that in such a large scale?
First of all, I would say child sex abuse, and not just child sex abuse, whether it's prostitution and whatnot. These things, I'm going to say two sets of things. First of all, it exists everywhere, right? First of all, it exists everywhere. No doubt, it exists in the Muslim world, definitely. But at the same time, why it exists far, it's more widespread in the Western world, is because first of all, you have all these institutional failures, right? And on top of that, the families are breaking down. So you got two pillars here which are collapsing. If you don't rely on families, if you have large groups of children running away from home, okay, in other parts of the world, it's because the families are poor anyway. But here, where you have obesity, children can eat at home, but they're running away from home for whatever reason. And these
because they believe they can get away with it, isn't it? He goes back to that problem if he or she feels free.
But the sad thing is, some of these kids have run away from home because they were abused, and then when they go into social care, there's a higher rate of them being abused again. So, which is, subhanAllah, this is really sad. So you got the twin evils of the social issue, the social cultural issue, and also the institutional failures.
Jazakallah khair. Grooming, Brother Abu Omar, is surely a despicable act. But what should really be held accountable? Who should really be held accountable? Police, social services, the participants, or the government, and why?
I think
even the social workers are corrupt, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely. I think with the Rotterdam case, or one of the particular cases, all the Labour the MPs resigned. The head of social services, staff resigned because of their failures. But I think these are all. And
there was another problem in Haringey. Remember, Baby P. I felt sorry for that boy.
And the social services,
there was a systematic failure.
Has resigned as well. And I think the government or the system over here is actually very, easily scapegoats individuals, but they never actually questions their own doctrine about life, about morality, about family values, or what needs to be changed, how to actually fix the whole problem. So when it comes to, for example, like with these issues, they say, okay, you're under fire, you should go. Someone needs to go. Someone heads needs to roll. And
but that's not going to solve the problem by dismissing one person from a department.
Yeah, I think the whole thing is a very root cause of the problem. And I think, Brother Nizal has said...
I've got a text from one of our listeners. He's saying, what are the dangers of Muslim leaders instead of establishing facts about this corruption and correctly identifying the root causes, lash out against Muslims, effectively jumping on bandwagon of the biased media? So what they mean, Brother Nizal, is... Sometimes, I'm sure you hear this from our community leaders. Yeah, why shouldn't they have tight rules on us? Because look what's happening. Our own people are doing X, Y, Z. You see, they become very antagonizing and hostile towards their own community without actually understanding the root of the problem, for example, or taking a global view on this. What kind of advice can you give to such people?
Okay, well, if we take the example of the 9 men in Rochdale, they were integrated into British society. They were integrated into the nightlife. So just because...
So what Muslims will say, see, we're corrupt. See, look at the 9 problems. So we're trying to pull that problem into our own home, as it were. Trying to say, but this is not the case, is it? Sorry, I interrupted you, but please go ahead.
Yeah, but by integrating, I mean, obviously we're living in this society, so it is a good idea we integrate when it comes to things such as learning the language. This is good, but we can still. This is
But that's not the type of integration they're calling for.
It's a different type of integration. But so in terms of the other type of integration, we should stick to our Islamic values, and we need to make a distinction between that and cultural values back home. So we should definitely stick to our Islamic values.
And that's not to say, just to clarify so the listeners are clear, that's not to say if a Muslim does a wrong act, we cannot condone that act but condemn it. But at the same time, understand the scale of the problem. I think that's the listener's point, is that, look, we shouldn't immediately look at our faults and say we're this, we're that, as opposed to understanding the problem, because we sometimes, by doing that, we're neglecting the global issue, the wider issue, which is the values.
Of course. I mean, the problem is that Muslims are always under the microscope when it comes to the media. Always. Only 2 weeks after the Rochdale incident, there were non-Muslim men who were caught with their crimes, and there was never a big deal out of this. The large-scale sex abuse against children over here has been exported abroad. So you have, people like Gary Glitter, who's a famous musician from the past, who they would go to Thailand, places like Thailand, where children would be abused over there by tourists. Even if you ignore child sex abuse, prostitution in different parts of the world, particularly, say, in Greece, where it's legalized because it can be taxed. There's this issue of the institutions and the culture. There's an issue of the institutions and the culture, and I believe, going back to the previous question, there's a vicious cycle here that's going on. You see all the systematic failures of the institutions. The police, they're not taking particular issues seriously. If there's a case of someone who comes forward saying they've been abused, and the amount of paperwork involved just for something to go ahead, the amount of paperwork involved for a possible child sex abuse to go from one institution to another, all these systematic failures, all it ever seems to do is it pushes people to change legislation. We're always relying on legislation or government to do things, but by doing that, by pushing that direction of trying to perfect government, we're relying the society at large, and you get this from parents, you get this from teachers, from every level of society. There's always a heavier reliance on what will the government do, what will the next prime minister do, and
but they're not doing anything, even because.
But by doing this, the society becomes one-dimensional, because we then rely only on social institutions, and then essentially the family institution becomes too weak.
Jazakallah khair. There is another text, Brother Abu Omar. I remember the discussion is always what is about these Pakistani men, that they do these kinds of things. But even today, there are 1,400 men, largely from the indigenous community, that are being investigated for grooming. Is there an agenda to attack Muslims and Muslim values? And is Islam to blame for these acts? Brother Abu Umar,
as I said very initially in my talk, that in no stretch of imagination that this crime can be actually levied onto the Muslims.
Cannot be attributed to the Muslim community. But why is it that the case, though? I mean,
the case is, as I
why
said,
is the media? Why do they have something against us?
I think you see, I don't want it to sound too political on this, but the thing is, as I said, Muslim community is a small community in this country or in the Western nations.
And we're still vulnerable. We don't have a representative.
We're still vulnerable. We don't have a representative. And the other thing is that when the media actually, sensationalizes this kind of news, there aren't a lot of people actually going and challenging that. It seems that there's more of the other side, like, for example, like Islamophobes who actually support this narrative that is Muslims to be blamed. They got something inherent, and they've done this crime, but they ignore the other side.
Jazakallah khair. As we've seen from Brother Mamun's comments, it seems the Muslim community is under a lot of pressure. For my question to Brother Nizal is, as we know, Muslims are already under pressure. How can Muslim protect the community from being stereotyped with sex-related media sensationalization? Should there be more education, or should we challenge the media narrative? Because obviously we're being cornered into one side, and there's the media. And unfortunately, we do not have a say in the media. We don't have powerful media outlets like other religious communities who have in this country. So how can we kind of come back?
Can I just come on to that? Because I think we did still have some time. One of the other reasons why I think that Muslim has been a easy target is because Muslim has been easy target. One of the reasons why is the government actually when these political events happen around the world, the government's always blaming, it tends to blame Islam and the Muslim country, what's happening in the Muslim country. So the government started it off, if you like.
Some of the media outlets are definitely pro-government, definitely.
Pro-government, yes.
The
so when it comes to Islamic fundamentalism, when it comes to, for example, foreign relations in the foreign countries, when it comes to Pakistan, India, and terrorism, a lot of these things are fueled by the government. A lot of this fueled by the, if you like, the Zionist, community out there, and because they've actually, set precedents on attacking the Muslims. So when such cases about pedophilia or child grooming,
you don't see that. You don't see the media saying to the Jewish community, for example,
happens to be a Muslim. Everyone can jump on that because we're
vulnerable, we're weak.
Yeah, because we're vulnerable, we're weak, and a precedent has been already set up. A platform has been already set up that whereby even the government has been attacking us, so it's easy to attack the Muslim community again, even on the newer issues like child grooming.
So, Brother Nizal, the very little maybe opportunities we may have in this country from looking at it from a wider perspective, from the media outlets, what can we do? What can Muslim leaders do, for example, and our listeners, Muslim listeners, what can they do to kind of respond?
The issue is we need an intellectual leadership that can respond on our behalf, and this is lacking at the moment. Most of our community leaders, whether it be imams or whatnot, there's always a focus on ibadat, which is obviously this is part of our deen. There's no denying that. We do that, but at the same time, there needs to be an intellectual response to all the criticism that takes place. The reason why it has gone this far, is because from the very beginning, when the first red line was drawn against the Muslims, pushed back, most Muslims never responded. So when there was negative coverage and talk of jihad means holy war, and then poor mispronunciation of the word, Muslims did not come out and respond. So then the red line was pushed further. Then it was focused on Palestinians being terrorists. Muslims did not respond again. The red lines were pushed further. So we've allowed ourselves to become cornered. This has led to that situation. And as for what freedoms we have in this society, yes, in society they'll talk about freedom of speech, freedom of that, and so on. But the reality is, if it's freedom of speech to challenge government, to challenge the normal narrative in the media, you're never going to be given that platform. You will never be given a platform on the news
Should we expect? Are we going to be fooling ourselves by expecting the Western media, the media outlets, to look after our interests and represent our views? Some people, unfortunately, some listeners, there's some listeners who expect the Western media to say things in favor of Islam. Unfortunately, the fact of the matter is, what do you think?
Some people have bought into the idea of freedom of speech, this idealistic, utopia, this idea that, Muslims, all we have to do, we need to get on TV, on BBC, we need to respond. But the reality is, they're always going to get that hardline imam who no one really knows. Nobody ever knows who this hardline imam is, but BBC will manage to pluck them out, put them on TV so that Bob and Dave can see, and to show to the non-Muslims how, ignorant we are. Unfortunately, that's the promotion, that's the idea. So we won't have that platform. We need to create our own platforms. That's the way it needs to be. We need to correct the narrative as well. That's the only way.
That brings me to the Brother Omar, to Abu Omar. In terms of, it seems that when we go on the media, sometimes as he said, some individuals are very silly when they talk in the media, and they obviously, their media has an own objective in promoting the speech of these individuals and promoting these individuals for Dave and John to see. But in terms of how robust should our response be from a ideological point of view, in terms of should we shy away from speaking the truth, because we only fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
I think the thing
is, shouldn't we speak the truth?
I think it is. I think there are a lot of our community is speaking the truth out there, but the problem is when a group of Muslims actually talk truth, they are shunned away. They are sort of like barred away, sidelined. They are fined. They are demonized. They are labeled as fringe organizations, or they are labeled as they are extremists. And this is where we see that the government's relentless effort in actually dividing the Muslim community into extremists and moderates. And even, recently we found that, when the government didn't have its own way through the moderates, after being with them for so long, now they're trying to actually, prop up the Sufis against the moderates. So we find that the government is playing this, tic-tac-toe, game all the time with the Muslim community. And sometimes we find that the government also actually pays these separate communities over the other. We know about the Kulliam Foundation, where the government is actually
absolutely they were set up to create
and then spending millions of pounds. So I don't think that we will. It's difficult to actually unite and have one voice from the Muslim community as long as the government and the institution of this country is trying to actually divide the Muslim community's voice, divide the Muslim community's solidarity. It's not going to happen. The only way it's going to happen is that when we actually rise up ideologically, when we have Muslim will have a state of their own in a Muslim world. And when that state, for example, is revived, has its own institutions, has its own universities, like before. Once we had our best universities where people from Western nations used to come to us for education.
It's quite ironic now. Muslims are coming to the West to learn education.
So when we have our a stronghold in those Muslim countries, then we can say that we will have a solidified voice against these crimes, and we can really represent ourselves.
Jazakallah khair. Listeners, I think it's important that we understand that inshallah we only have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fear, and when it comes to speaking the truth, we should speak the truth in a very diplomatic and a constructive way, inshallah, and that we should not buckle down and compromise on our values, and that values which comes from Islam, inshallah. So emphatically you put the root cause of this filthy and dangerous act coming from the liberal and secular mindset and the system of governance. How can the Muslim community lead the elimination of this problem from the society, Brother Nizal? Because as we know, we've talked about liberal values and how filthy it is. It is the root of this, the causes of these problems that we're having, which is quite widespread. Muslims and Islam has something different to offer to the Muslims. So what is it that we can do to eliminate this?
Okay. Well, first of all, the chances of having people, trying to, non-Muslims in British society, for them to understand Islam and to, even embrace Islam, I'm not saying it would never happen.
Because a lot of the non-Muslim listeners, unfortunately, may not know about Islam and how Islam has an alternative way, a solution to these problems.
What I would say is something practical, though, and that is... if we put Islam aside for a moment, I just want to focus on secularism, what it is fundamentally. We don't live in a Christian society. It's not a Christian society.
It's an atheistic society. It's secular. Without Islam.
It's not
without
a question
any religion, actually.
It's not a question of Islam or Christianity, because the people in British society today are secular.
Yes, it's Islam or secularism, isn't it? That's what we're looking at. We're seeing here.
So the secular generation today are completely foreign from their grandparents who fought during the Second World War. Completely separate. If they remained Christian, going to church on Sundays, as an example, am I promoting Christianity? No, but
just for the benefit of the listeners, can you just explain secularism? Because what does that mean?
So secularism,
maybe some listeners may not understand what it really means.
So secularism historically was separating the church from the state.
So God doesn't have a say.
That's it. So as long as
your life.
That's it. If you practice religion in your spiritual, your spiritual acts, your rituals, that's fine. But the moment you step outside church, then that has to you follow the rules of a land, you follow the laws of a land to do with the government.
And that's exactly what happened. If you look at in
Christian history,
and even now, this is where the problems isn't it? If we go back to the topic we're discussing today, is because of this thinking, is the mindset and the perception that we have, that belief that we can get away with it. I'm not accountable. As long as I can get away with it, I will do it. Who am I? Because there's no accountability.
Of course.
For the Muslim, he knows that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who he's accountable to, and Allah is the one who is going to account him for all of his action. I think that's a very important point, isn't it?
And then
the accountability is there, whereas with liberal values, there's no accountability.
The thing is, you see, as you progress towards secularism even more. For example, the grandparents in Britain historically, they're already living in a secular society anyway. The church by then had long gone, essentially. But the point is, the way things are now, they're incredibly secular. Christmas itself is just a form of capitalism. That's all it is. It's just about buying gifts. It's just mass consumerism. It doesn't have the tradition that British grandparents once had, or even the US. So you begin to see, the more you go towards secularism, the more you have these sex crimes, the more you have these abuses. Yes, there was a situation that historically there was abuse by the church. And actually, there's a lot of abuse by the Buddhists
Jazakallah. Can you come back? Sorry, I'm trying to get for the benefit of the listeners. The question was in terms of what advice can you give to the Muslim listeners? What can they do to eliminate this problem? Maybe
I think what Brother Nizal is trying to say is that, look,
what can we do to eliminate this problem? Because there's a problem where we've discussed the problems and we've said the solution is not coming from the state. State, unfortunately,
I think
cannot solve this problem.
I think for the benefit
for the Muslim, surely, do we have a solution for this?
Obviously, the Muslim have a solution. The reason why, not because they are Asian or they come from a particular country, is because the creator of the universe has actually revealed a book. And this book is the Quran. And in that book, the Creator has said how to actually live life, what sort of mentality to, go
what kind of values that we can have. Allah Ta'ala is deciding,
Allah Ta'ala has decided for us
what is good for
and
mankind.
Unfortunately, for the non-Muslims over here, it's just a try and test. And this is why we find that
because it is intrinsically going to be flawed because it's coming from a man. It's a man-made system.
This is what I'm saying, because we are saying that, look, a lot of these problems can be managed by the family. If family is given the chance to protect their children, then it can be managed rather than actually giving it to the social services, rather than giving it to police, rather than giving it to the teachers.
So what you're saying is Islam has a blueprint for people, for solution for this kind of problems to eliminate.
What Brother Nizal is trying to say is that the non-Muslims are victims. They're not necessarily the people are at fault or people are to be blamed.
No, absolutely. I take that point out. There are a lot of non-Muslim listeners who are listening who may want to benefit from this as well.
They're victim in the sense that they're hardcore secularists who actually really, in a way, denying God, or the atheists who are denying God and the values that God has sent to the people to manage, to live by. These hardcore secularists, ultra secularists actually remove those values from society. And this is why we find all these problems. And even the Muslims and the non-Muslims are suffering as a result of this disease and violence and breakup of families and etc. And as a Muslims, because we have this guidance, we can take this guidance to the non-Muslim and we can say, look, here is the blueprint of life. Here is the message from God, and this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking us to actually lead our life. This is the values to go by. And this is what we need to establish in state and society, so that these ultra secularists will not have their own way and play with human lives, if you like, and which is causing so much destruction and unhappiness.
Yeah, because the fact is, when I did point this out in terms of responsibility, you were saying a lot of things, a lot of activities in the nightlife, night economy happens hidden as well in alleyways and in streets. Is because these people, they don't believe that they are accountable, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching them, isn't it? So again goes back to the value. So as a Muslim, if I believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching my actions and I'm going to be responsible, and one day I will appear before Him and I'll be accountable for my action, so would automatically eliminate that problem that we were just discussing in terms of the value, because then I'll be more careful, more responsible of my actions. So Brother Nizal,
I'd want
even non-Muslim can. What advice can you give them? I mean, they can also look into this, can't they, in terms of understanding our religion?
Yeah, in terms of accountability that the Muslim has, in terms of fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we need to realize that a non-Muslim will look at that and say, well, this is not unique because Christianity has the belief in God, for example, but
it's very dogmatic, isn't it, with the greatest of respect, but go ahead.
The unique element of Islam is that and this is why atheist secularists have led the assault against Christianity, and unfortunately they've done it against other religions as well, where you have huge child sex abuse in the Catholic Church. it's for the same reason it exists even amongst the Buddhist monasteries, and the reason simply being is they believe in celibacy, whereby a priest or a monk does
That's
not
quite unnatural, isn't it?
Does not marry.
That's
Celibacy
right.
is where they don't
It's very
marry.
unnatural.
They don't believe in relationships. They don't. So there's that one extreme. Whether they don't believe in sex in marriage or outside marriage, they don't believe in
Absolutely.
it at
So
all.
it comes to an end. Comes to a point where people exploit, isn't it?
The opposite extreme is obviously where you have a culture where it's, we only live once. I do what I want to do. It's all about happiness. Blah blah blah.
This is the
There's that
point.
extreme. With Islam, we don't have a clergy. We're not meant to have a clergy anyway. An imam is meant to get married. It's encouraged.
It's natural for him to get married and have family, isn't it?
So the problem is, it's not the Catholic Church. I'm not.
No.
We should never blame it. It's not because the Catholic
No,
Church
it's the
or
lack
the Buddhist
of-
monasteries. It's because of the belief in celibacy. So this is the unique element of Islam, whereby it's got its twin groups of institutions. You've got the institution of government that exists in Islam. It may not exist anywhere in the world right now. But then you also have the institution of the family as well. There's a heavy focus on family values on the one hand, and where you have a situation where abuse does take place within the family itself, how do you deal with that? The answer is quite simply this. In the Western world, they're always debating, using their own intellect to figure out
which
what's
is
the
very
solution.
limited, isn't it? Because
It's
man's
all
intellect
human
is
beings, we're
limited. Very
We're
limited. And
therefore, we can never come up with the full solution. And you've seen over and over again, all the solutions that secularism has is always patchwork solutions. There's a hole in this gene, so now they're putting a new patch, and then they're putting a new patch somewhere else. And this is how it always is with child abuse. They're putting one legislation, introducing a new one, and they can never fill the hole. Essentially, that's what happens. With Islam, it's not about playing politically correct. The rules in Islam are what they are. Some people may say it's a bit strict in how Islam deals with rapists, how it deals with murderers, but the law in Islam, it is what it is. It's
because
not
when you
going to
understand it properly, when you understand Islam properly from a rational point of view, when you study the religion properly, this is for the benefit of our non-Muslim listeners. Maybe that when you understand the religion rationally as an ideology, as a way of life, maybe some of the questions would be resolved, isn't it?
So, for example, the fact that the institution of family over here is weakening because more and more people increasingly, they always look to the government for solutions all the time. There's poverty outside. What can the government do? Our children are doing this or doing that. What can the government do? Always relying on the government all the time. You do need a good government as an institution. You do need a family as an institution. You need both. You need the twins. You need these two pillars of society. Absolutely. But where the families fail and you need to bring the police, get the police involved, people may consider Sharia law as a bit too extreme. But if it was implemented in the Muslim world, right, as an example, you'd not have these petty fines. You wouldn't have these petty the criminal charges that exist. God forbid that the laws in the Muslim world would ever become soft like they are over here, because the moment you have that situation, it's even worse.
Jazakallah khair. Brother Abu Umar, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to add is that, obviously, we've talked about the beliefs and the values that, the secularism actually, allows to flourish in the society. These are the cause of all this pedophilia and child grooming, and also the breakup of the family, and how the society has actually become a nanny state, taking control of every situation. And it has led to disintegration of the society. But there's other things as well, such as like allowing free trade of alcohol, allowing free trade of drugs, allowing the free mixing of the society. These are all triggers, if you like, all the sparks that are out there, imminent to be created a fire out of. And this is what it is. And but the thing is, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the guidance that He's given us in advance what are the dangers that we need to be avoid. He, for example, says that don't go near to, for example, zina, alcohol, and things like
games
that.
of chance.
So games of chance and things like that. So when a nation, when a society doesn't have that divine guidance, it is surely to actually fail. The only thing that is keeping it alive is actually its military power, and because it doesn't have any values. And another reason why it's actually still going is because there's no alternative in the Muslim world to show the values and the strength of Islam in state form as well as in family life.
Jazakallah khair, brother Abu Umar. Yeah. Thank you for both of you for coming into our studio. Jazakallah khair. Well, listeners, as we've seen, inshallah, through our discussion, that Islam has got nothing to do with this grooming. It's actually the liberal values, and so inshallah we shouldn't be shy away from speaking the truth, and we should always remain vigilant and aware that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one we should be afraid of. So jazakallah khair for joining us, and inshallah until the next show, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.